I valued you more than anyone.
I used it to save us.
You used me.
I woke up as the youngest son of the richest family in South Korea, 9 years old, silk sheets, antique furniture, the faint smell of sandalwood and money, and I knew exactly how every single person in this family was going to die. Not a guess, not a feeling. I knew. I knew which uncle would betray us. I knew which cousin would destroy the empire from the inside. I knew which stock would crash, which president would win, which plane would explode over the ocean. And I knew my brother, the one person in this family who actually loved people more than money, would die alone in a prison cell. No visitors, no funeral, just a good man rotting behind glass, while the cousin who put him there ate dinner in his house, slept in his bed, and married the woman my brother was supposed to love. In my old life, I watched it all happen. Every betrayal, every backroom deal. I knew everything, and I couldn't change a single thing. Then I died and woke up here, inside the story, inside the family, inside a body small enough to carry, but a mind loaded with 30 years of future. October 4th, 1987, Cheongsimjae, the private estate of the Chen family, owners of Sunyang Group, the most powerful conglomerate in the country. Tomorrow was grandfather's 60th birthday, the day the first domino falls. I didn't think. I ran. The antique room was 3 hallways and 1 flight of stairs away. I got there just as my brother's hand was reaching for grandfather's watch, a gold Patek Philippe, worth more than most people's houses. In the original story, he stole it, got caught. It was the beginning of the end for him, a crack that Dao Jun would spend years widening until the whole thing shattered. Brother, don't. Xingjun turned around, surprised. He was 10, taller than me, wider than me, with a grin that could light up a funeral. He looked at me the way he always did, like I was the most important thing in any room. Yijun, what are you doing here? I grabbed his hand, told him if he needed money, I had some. He laughed, ruffled my hair, said he didn't need it, but thanks. That was Xingjun. You offer him your savings and he gives you a smile worth 10 times more. Then the door opened, and a boy our age walked in, Chen Daojun. In another life, this kid destroyed everything. He wormed his way into grandfather's trust, manipulated every sibling against each other, and dismantled the family empire from the inside like a surgeon removing organs. He married the girl. He stole the company. He won. Our eyes met. His were sharp, calculating, nothing like a child's. I knew, right then, he wasn't just a kid either. He was like me. He remembered. The race had already started, and I was the only one who knew there were 2 runners. Xingjun shoved Daojun. Daojun fell backward into grandfather's favorite porcelain vase. It shattered on the marble floor like a gunshot. Beautiful sound. Terrible timing. The adults came running. Daojun's father, my father, our mothers. When they saw the broken vase, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I stepped forward before anyone could point a finger. I did it! I hit him. Xingjun immediately pushed in front of me. No, I hit him. Leave my brother out of this. From the doorway, a pair of ancient eyes watched us. Chen Yangjae, the founder, the emperor, the man whose single word could bankrupt a corporation or build one overnight. He stood there in silence, watching his grandsons shield each other, and something shifted behind those cold eyes. United as one, he said. These are my grandsons. The birthday banquet that night was a battlefield dressed in silk. Each of grandfather's children presented gifts, a Qing dynasty painting, imported wines, rare art. Then it was Uncle Runji's turn, Daojun's father. He pulled out a movie disc, at a billionaire's birthday. The room went quiet. Then it erupted in laughter. Grandfather picked up the disc between 2 fingers, like it was contaminated, and dropped it in the trash. He didn't even look at Runji's face. I watched Daojun clench his fists from across the room. I watched his shame turn into something sharper, something that would grow for years. Then I presented my gift, a Ming Dynasty vase Xingjun had given me. Xingjun followed with a watch worth millions. Grandfather beamed. He said 3 words, good, good, good. And for a moment, the entire family looked at us like we were the sun. I picked the movie disc out of the trash when nobody was watching. Someday, films would be worth billions. I could wait. 3 days later, I told my father to back the 3rd-place presidential candidate, a man named Ro Tae-woo, who nobody believed had a chance. Father thought I was crazy. Grandfather nearly threw us both out of the room. That same evening, the 2 frontrunners broke their alliance on live television. The pundits scrambled, the experts stammered, and the 3rd-place candidate, the one nobody believed in, rose to the top overnight. Grandfather summoned me to his study. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from excitement. How did you know? When the snipe and the clam fight, I said. The fisherman benefits. He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Then he placed the entire election fund, billions of won, on my call. The next morning, Dao Jun arrived at grandfather's door with the same advice. Back Ro Tae Woo. Put the money on the third candidate, but the money was already placed. The decision was already made. And when grandfather dismissed him, didn't even look up from his newspaper, Dao Jun's face went through 5 emotions in 2 seconds. My father added the finishing touch. He leaned into Dao Jun's ear and said something I wasn't supposed to hear. Don't have any more ideas about my son. Otherwise, I will make your entire family disappear from this world. Dao Jun left without a word, but I saw his fists, white-knuckled, shaking. He knew someone had beaten him to the punch. He just didn't know how. Not yet. And that was the beginning. The first domino had fallen, but this time it fell my way. Grandfather's election bet paid off. Ro Tae Woo won the presidency. Sunyang Group now had the Blue House on speed dial. And me, the 9-year-old who made the call, I was suddenly the most interesting person at every family dinner. But I didn't want dinner. I wanted land. The Longtai Development Zone was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in Seoul. 10 billion won, at least. Every Chaebol in Korea wanted it. The system wanted me to acquire it for 50 million. That's like buying a penthouse with pocket change. So I built a garbage dump. I went to grandfather with a simple pitch. There's a piece of Sunyang land right next to the Longtai zone. Build a waste disposal facility on it. The old man squinted at me. Then he understood. A garbage dump next to a development zone? Nobody would pay full price for land that smelled like yesterday's trash. The property value crashed overnight. At the auction, the opening bid dropped from 10 billion to 30 million. Nobody wanted it. Nobody except Ju Rungi, the chairman of Daeing Group, Sunyang's biggest rival. His people knew there was oil under the soil, or at least they thought they did. I walked into Ju Rungi's private room alone, a 9-year-old boy sitting across from the second most powerful businessman in Korea. He looked at me like I was a joke, so I told him the punchline. The oil was a thin layer, worthless for extraction. I knew because I'd read my uncle Dongji's diary, the same uncle who'd secretly tipped Daeng off about the oil to inflate the price. One phone call confirmed everything I said. Ju Rungi's face went through 3 stages: disbelief, verification, and something I'd later learned to recognize as respect disguised as annoyance. He backed down. We got Longtai for 50 million won. I removed the garbage dump the next week. Total cost of the most valuable land in Seoul, pocket change, and a few days of bad smell. Somewhere in that blur of weeks, a girl appeared in my life. I went to father's study, looking for blueprints, and found Mao Xianmin instead, the daughter of Shencheng Daily's chairman, sitting in a chair too tall for her, swinging her feet like the room belonged to her. She was my age, white dress, curious eyes. She pinched my nose and told me I was different from my brother. Xingjun would have bragged for 20 minutes. I just said, "I'm ordinary." She laughed. It sounded like someone who wasn't used to being surprised. In my past life, she married Xingjun out of duty, hated it, watched him crumble. She deserved better. They both did. So in the garden, under the maple trees, with servants watching and my mother drinking tea on the balcony, I walked up to Mao Xianmin and kissed her on the cheek. The world froze. My mother ran over, not to scold me, but to check if I was okay. That woman's priorities were something else. Xingjun's mouth hung open. The servants looked like they'd seen a murder. Father, smooth as always, offered a marriage arrangement to Chairman Mao before the scandal could grow legs. Chairman Mao looked at me, the kid who'd just outplayed Ju Rungi at an auction, the kid the president owed a favor to, and did the math. He agreed. 1 kiss. A media empire locked down as an ally, and a girl who'd spend the next 10 years trying to figure out if I'd done it because I liked her or because I needed her father's newspaper. The answer was both. I'd tell her that someday. Maybe. By October, I'd built something that shouldn't have existed for another 20 years. A working smartphone, crude by future standards. But in 1987, it was magic in a metal case. A screen, a phone, games, a camera, all in something you could hold in one hand. I used it to make one call. Grandfather was overseas. His return flight was Cal 828, Baghdad to Seoul. I knew the date. I knew the time. I knew that a bomb would blow that plane out of the sky, killing every soul on board. I called his secretary, told him I'd had a dream, a plane exploding, fire on the water. I said it like a child who'd just woken from a nightmare. Please don't let grandfather board that flight. The secretary thought I was being dramatic, but I was Chen Youngjae's grandson, and you don't ignore a grandchild's warning when a few billion won of corporate dynasty rides on the old man's heartbeat. He changed the flight. The next evening, the news broke. Cal 828 had crashed. All passengers dead, 95 people, 20 crew members, gone. The family gathered in the living room. Father's hands shook as he dialed the airline. Grandmother collapsed. Mother buried her face in her hands. The children wept, some of them. Uncle Runji's son-in-law hugged his wife and sobbed, but I saw the way his shoulders relaxed. The old man who'd suppressed him for decades was finally gone. The leash was off. Then, the front door opened. Chen Youngjae walked in wearing a travel cloak, rain dripping from his shoulders, looking like he'd just fought his way out of the underworld. He scanned the room of tear-stained faces and said 6 words that I'd remember for the rest of my life. "What are you crying for? Is this a funeral?" Nobody moved. The crying stopped, like someone had hit a switch, and in the silence, I saw every face rearrange itself. Relief for some, shock for others, and for a few, something that looked a lot like disappointment. That's a Chaebol family. The wolves mourn the king, but some of them mourn because the hunt is over too soon. Grandfather confronted me in his study the next day, shut the door, locked it, sat across from me with eyes that could cut glass. How did I know about the election? The plane? How did a boy who'd been dying his whole life suddenly wake up healthy and start making moves that outpaced grown men? I gave him the only answer that would work. When I was dying, I saw death. Death told me I cannot die, that I must make Sunyang Group the #1 in Korea. He stared at me for a long time. Then he let it go. Not because he believed me, because I was profitable. In a Chaebol family, results silence questions. He gave me 50,000 square meters of land in Bundang. He leased me the Longtai development zone for 10 million won a year, and he invested $100 million to build my phone factory in exchange for 30% of the shares. Smart Era Group was born. What happened next, I could describe in detail, but 10 years is a long time, and the highlights tell the story better than the dailies. Year 1, Smart Era's phones swept Korea. Every family wanted one. The president, the same man grandfather backed on my call, helped clear the regulatory path. Year 3, international sales began. 20% of the world's population would eventually hold one of our phones. Year 5, I developed computers, chat applications, digital services. Bundang, the pottery field grandfather thought was worthless, became a city of 390,000 people, worth 24 billion won. Year 8, I quietly converted 80% of Smart Era's Korean won to US dollars. My executives thought I'd lost my mind. Uncle Dongji thought I was laundering money. Nobody understood. They didn't need to. Not yet. By year 10, I was 20 years old, 1.80 meters, hundreds of billions in assets, the founder of the world's largest smartphone company, and still, the second son of a Chaebol family who had to fight for every seat at the table. Uncle Dongji challenged me at a family meeting. He said Sunyang deserved 80% of Smart Era's profits, not 30. I told him phones have a 2-year lifespan. 80% of users replace them. And who said we only sell in one country? Grandfather sided with me. The 30% held. But I wasn't paying attention to Dongji's argument. I was watching his eyes. They had the same look Daojun's father had when grandfather threw his movie disc in the trash. Envy. The kind that curdles into something dangerous when you leave it alone long enough. And speaking of Daojun, he'd been quiet for 10 years. Too quiet. He'd gotten into Seoul National University's law department. Graduated top of his class. Grandfather even gave him a small fund. He was building something, somewhere, with someone. I didn't know what yet, but I knew the silence wouldn't last. It never does. Not in this family. Hando Steel was Korea's most important steelmaker, and in about 72 hours, Daojun's partner Woo Shixian was going to try to buy it. In the original story, that acquisition turned into a nightmare. Woo Shixian bid the price up to 750 billion won, 5 times the asking price, using shell companies and Uncle Dongji as an inside man. Sunyang got the steel company, but the debt nearly killed them. I wasn't going to let that happen again, so I did what I always did. I moved first. I went to Chairman Lee Hao-rong's office directly. No appointment, no intermediary. Just a 20-year-old kid walking into the boardroom of Korea's biggest steel company and sitting down. He offered me tea. I offered him a deal. 400 billion won. Full asking price. No negotiation. Plus 3% of Smart Era's shares. A permanent revenue stream that would keep paying long after the acquisition closed. He tried to push for 5%. I stood up and headed for the door. He grabbed my arm before I reached the handle. We settled at 3%, 200 billion won, and he keeps his job as chairman. I let him think he'd negotiated a win. In reality, I'd have paid double. The alternative, letting Daojun weaponize Hando Steel against my family, was worth any price. When Daojun and Woo Shixian arrived the next morning, the papers were already signed. The receptionist told them the company had been sold yesterday. Woo Shixian, the man who'd eventually become chairman of Sunyang Group in the original timeline, the man I feared more than Daojun himself, simply nodded and walked away. No outburst, no argument. That calm scared me more than any tantrum would have. Daojun stood outside Hando Steel's gates for a long time. I know because someone told me later. He stood there, staring at the building, processing the pattern, the presidential bet, the long tie auction, and now this. 3 times I'd gotten there first. 3 times I'd taken exactly what he was reaching for. He wasn't confused anymore. He was certain. Someone was playing the same game as him. Grandfather arranged my admission to Seoul National University's law department. Money could do that in Korea. The right donation, the right phone call, and suddenly a 20-year-old billionaire is sitting in a lecture hall full of kids who'd studied their whole lives to be there. On campus, I reconnected with Shanmin. She'd grown into something extraordinary, 1.75 meters tall, sharp-jawed, with the kind of beauty that made people stop talking when she entered a room. She invited me to a hotel opening ceremony for Xiancheng Daily. I went, expecting a party. What I got was a chess move. She'd orchestrated the entire event to publicly announce that Xiancheng Daily was backed by Sunyang Group and Smart Era. The guest list was curated. The press was positioned. Every photograph would show her standing next to me, and every caption would say, "This newspaper has the 2 most powerful companies in Korea behind it. Anyone thinking about competing should reconsider." I'd been used, expertly, beautifully. "How are you going to repay me for this?" I asked her afterward. She smiled like she'd been waiting for the question. "I already did. Now everyone knows you have the media on your side. You're welcome." This woman was going to either save me or ruin me, possibly both. That same week, I bumped into someone else, literally. Shu Minying was carrying a stack of library books across the law department courtyard. I turned a corner. She turned the same corner. Books everywhere. She scrambled to pick them up, apologizing before she even looked at my face. When she did look up, she froze. In my past life, Minying was Dao Jun's love, a prosecutor's daughter with enough principle to fill a cathedral and enough stubbornness to keep it standing. She refused to use her father's name. She carried her own books. She ate at the cheapest restaurants and studied until midnight because she believed earning things was the only way they counted. She was everything this world wasn't. Rich kids at the elite club tried to push me around that night. Some heir from a trading company thought I should toast to his health. Xingjun, who'd heard I was attending, showed up unannounced, revealed I was Smart Era's chairman, and the guy was expelled from the club before his drink hit the table. Afterward, I took Minying to a noodle shop, a real one, fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, an owner who called me kid because he had no idea who I was. We ate beef noodles and fried dumplings. She laughed at how much I ate. At the car, she called me Appa. She didn't mean anything by it, just a word. Just the way Korean girls talk to an older guy they trust. I should have let it go. I didn't. The Coca-Cola deal came a month later. Bruce Jackson, head of Coca-Cola, wanted Smart Era to promote his products through our mobile platform. Global reach, 300 billion won on the table. I told him I wanted 5% of Coca-Cola's shares for 10 years. He laughed. Then he stopped laughing because I wasn't joking. 20% of the world's phones were ours. His board of directors needed us more than we needed them. Overnight, they agreed. I converted every one from that deal into US dollars. My VP, Lin Jixuan, questioned it quietly. My uncle questioned it loudly. Nobody got an answer. Meanwhile, at a racing event, Sun Yang's car exploded on the track. Engine failure. The car spun through the air, hood shattering, engine on fire. Zhu Rongyi, the Daying chairman, was in the VIP box, grinning like a kid at Christmas. He walked over to grandfather and delivered the cruelest line I'd ever heard one old man say to another. "You have no family, Chen Yangjae." 5 sons standing behind him. Our side of the box, empty faces, silent shame. Grandfather nearly slapped my father. I caught his hand mid-swing, the first person ever to block the chairman's arm. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. Then he turned and walked away. Disappeared. No driver, no secretary, no trail. I found him 2 hours later, alone in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Seoul, his secret place. An old truck sat in the center, Shunwang Transportation, printed on the side in faded paint. The company he'd built before Sunyang, before the billions, before the empire and the enemies and the grandsons fighting over scraps. He was sitting on the concrete floor, trying to fix a car engine with his bare hands, grease on his shirt, oil on his fingers. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked old. I sat down next to him, didn't say anything for a while. Then, I opened my bag and pulled out a set of car blueprints, designs that didn't exist in this world yet. Cars that were faster, lighter, and more efficient than anything Korea had ever produced. His eyes went wide. I told him my plan. Smart Era would partner with Sunyang on an automotive venture. We had the steel from Hando. We had the blueprints. We had the technology. All he needed to provide was the funding and his name. For one quiet moment in that warehouse, with engine oil on both our hands, we weren't chairman and grandson. We were just 2 people who loved cars. That was the honest part. The dishonest part came next. I proposed a 3-way automotive alliance. Smart Era would hold 60%, Sunyang Group 20. Daying Group, 20. I sold it to grandfather as a strategic masterstroke, unite the two biggest conglomerates under Smart Era's lead. I sold it to Zhu Rongyi as a lifeline. His company was bleeding money, and 20% of something was better than 100% of nothing. Both groups poured their remaining liquid funds into the project. Billions of won, committed to factories, parts, assembly lines. What nobody noticed, what nobody was supposed to notice, was that I'd already moved my money somewhere else. 80% of Smart Era's assets were sitting in US dollars, untouchable, invisible, growing. I didn't create the alliance to share power. I created it because in 18 months, an economic crisis would destroy every company in Korea holding Korean won. And when the country's second largest auto company went bankrupt, I needed to be the only person in the room with real money. The trap was set, the clock was ticking, and not a single person at the table knew they were sitting on a time bomb. I signed the contracts with a steady hand and a clean conscience. Well, mostly clean. Uncle Dongji struck first. He went to grandfather with numbers, real numbers. Smart Era's Korean accounts were nearly empty. The $300 billion from Coca-Cola vanished overnight, converted to US dollars, and invested in foreign stock. On paper, Smart Era looked like a hollow shell, a company with a brand and no blood. Grandfather called a family meeting, the full assembly. Father, Dongji, Aunt Huaying, everyone seated, everyone watching, and at the center of the room, me. The old man didn't yell. That would have been easier. Instead, he spoke in that low, precise voice that made the air feel thin. He said I'd been given everything, the land, the funding, the trust. He said what he gives, he can take back. He said what he doesn't give, I have no right to take. Father tried to stand up for me. Grandfather shut him down with a single look. For the first time since I'd been reborn, I stood in that room alone. So I turned to Uncle Dongji. Second uncle, I said, since we're being transparent today, would you like to tell grandfather about your meetings with Daying Group? The ones where you shared Sun Yang's bidding strategy before the Hondo Steel acquisition? The room went silent, not the polite silence of waiting, the silence of a blade being drawn. Or the time you leaked our semiconductor pricing to inflate their competing offer? Dongji's face drained of color. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Grandfather's eyes moved from me to Dongji, slowly, like a hawk adjusting its focus. Dongji backed out of the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. Nobody spoke. Grandfather looked at me one more time. Then he stood up and left. Upstairs, where nobody could hear him, I'm told he muttered one word. Good. He wanted an heir with teeth. I'd just shown him mine. That night, I found myself drinking alone at a street stall. Cheap soju, plastic cups, the kind of place a Chaebol's grandson should never be seen. That's where Kui Changji found me. He was my Aunt Huaying's husband, chief prosecutor of South Korea. On paper, one of the most powerful legal figures in the country. In reality, the family's doormat. He opened the car door for me, poured my wine, bowed when he spoke. 20 years of marriage to Huaying, and the family still called him the prosecutor who married up. He invited me to dinner at his home. Huaying was waiting. The table was set. A contract sat between the dishes. They wanted me to help Changji become a member of parliament. In exchange, 20% of Shenyang department store shares. I looked at the contract, picked it up, put it down. I don't want your shares, I said. Huaying's face tightened. That wasn't the script she'd rehearsed. In 6 months, I continued, the department store's value will drop by more than half. Your shares will be worth less than the paper they're printed on. I let that sink in. Then, I raised the stakes. I won't make him a parliament member. I'll make him mayor of Seoul. The room went so quiet, I could hear Changji's heartbeat. 3 conditions. First, he pays all expenses himself. Smart Era takes no financial burden. Second, absolute secrecy. No one finds out, especially not grandfather. Third, and this was the one that would cost him. From this day forward, Changji follows my orders. He looked at his wife. She looked at the floor. Then, back at him. She nodded. Kui Changji, chief prosecutor of South Korea, dropped to his knees in front of a 20-year-old boy. I accept. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. This was a man who'd been broken by decades of contempt, reaching for the only hand extended to him. The fact that it was mine, and that my hand came with strings, didn't make me noble. It made me necessary. A weapon doesn't choose who holds it. It just needs to be aimed. Weeks later, at a family gathering, I came face to face with the person I'd been circling for years. Chen Daojin had grown, sharper jaw, steadier eyes. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than Runji's movie disc collection, and a smile that could have passed a lie detector test. Next to him stood a man I recognized immediately, Wu Shixian, investment genius. Daojun's partner, the man who, in another timeline, would become chairman of Sunyang Group after Daojun burned it to ash. Daojun extended his hand. I shook it. He told me he admired what I'd built. So young, so impressive, almost like I could see the future. I told him I'd learned from a fortune-telling master. Very traditional, very accurate. We both smiled. The words were silk. The meaning was steel. After he left, I saw him pull out a handkerchief, wipe the hand that had touched mine, and throw the cloth in the trash. That told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. But the evening wasn't finished with me yet. That night, at the airport, I picked up my brother. Xingjun came through the arrivals gate, carrying too many bags, and a grin so wide it could have swallowed the terminal. He dropped everything and hugged me so hard my ribs creaked. Little brother, did you miss me? He'd brought me a watch from London, spent £1 million on it, probably haggled the seller for 2 hours and then tipped them double. That was Xingjun, generous past the point of reason. We drove home. He told me about school, about the food in England, about a girl who couldn't understand his accent. He laughed at his own stories. He called me little brother 14 times in 20 minutes. I counted. Back at Chungsimje, grandmother pinched his cheeks. Mother cried. Father pretended not to cry. And grandfather held Xingjun's hand and said, "You look thin," with a softness in his voice that he'd never used with me. I watched from the side, and I understood something I'd always known, but never let myself feel. No matter how many billions I earned, no matter how many companies I built, no matter how many chess moves I executed to keep this family from tearing itself apart, the old man's face only softened for Xingjun, the eldest grandson, the favorite, the one who would never have to prove his worth, because Chen Yangje loved him without conditions. I wasn't jealous. I was grateful, because that unconditional love was the thing I was fighting to protect. In another life, that laugh ended in a prison cell. That face went hollow behind glass. That warmth died on a concrete floor where no one came to say goodbye. Not this time. Whatever it costs. The grandfather's trust, the family's approval, my own conscience. Not this time. The crisis hit Korea like a freight train in the night. The International Monetary Fund stepped in. $21 billion in emergency loans. The conditions: open your financial markets, relax your labor laws, reform your chaebols. In plain language, hand over the keys to the house or lose the house entirely. Export rates had been over 30%. Now they were nothing. The won collapsed. Foreign trade froze. Factories went dark across the country. Companies that had taken generations to build, 3 generations of family, blood, sweat, and borrowed money, vanished in weeks, not months, weeks. 80% of Korean industries shut down. The Chaebols, Korea's untouchable kings, bled. Sunyang Group bled. Daeng Group bled. Everyone bled. Everyone except Smart Era. Our offices were calm. The lights were on. The coffee was fresh. My executives sat in the boardroom, staring at financial reports that made no sense to them, because every number was in US dollars, and every dollar was worth 10 times what it had been worth 6 months ago. Chairman Lee of Hando Steel looked at me across the conference table. His voice was barely a whisper. "You saw this coming." I didn't answer. I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. At the government meeting, the Prime Minister gathered every Chaebol chairman in Korea. He needed money. The national treasury was a corpse. He looked at the richest men in the country and asked them to donate. Grandfather said nothing. Jurungi said nothing. I said my assets were locked in long-term foreign stock investments with a 30% withdrawal penalty, which was true, and also irrelevant, because even with the penalty, I had more liquid cash than the Korean government. The Prime Minister looked at me like I'd personally insulted him, but he couldn't force the issue. Squeezing Smart Era would antagonize Sunyang and Daeng simultaneously. Even a desperate government knew better than to fight 3 tigers at once. I walked out untouched. Then Yagen Motors declared bankruptcy. Korea's second-largest auto company. 4.5 trillion won in debt. Factories across 3 provinces. Supply chains feeding half the country's automotive industry. All of it up for acquisition at fire sale prices. In another life, this was the prize that Daojun used to build his counter-empire. Not this time. Grandfather called an emergency board meeting. He sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his children, his executives, his lifetime of power. He said Sunyang had enough funds to acquire Yagen. I stopped him. With what money? The room went cold. I laid it out piece by piece. The 3-way auto alliance had consumed Sunyang's liquid reserves. The Daeng Group's cash was locked in the same project. The main transaction bank was already stretching Sunyang's credit to the limit. If grandfather pushed for Yagen now, the bank would cut them off. Not might. Would. Chen Dongji, for once, confirmed it. The cooperation fund was borrowed money. There was no cash left. Grandfather's face changed. I watched it happen in slow motion. The realization hit him like cold water. Not the crisis, not the bankruptcy, but something worse. The three-way alliance. The 60-20-20 deal. The partnership he'd celebrated as a strategic masterstroke. It was a drain valve. I'd proposed the alliance, knowing both groups would pour their remaining cash into it. I'd pitched it as unity, while quietly converting my own money to US dollars. When the crisis hit, Sunyang and Daeng were left holding empty bags, and Smart Era, untouched, unshaken, sitting on a mountain of dollars, was the only entity in Korea that could afford Yagen Motors. The old man stood up slowly. His hands were shaking, not from age, from something deeper. "You used me," he said. His voice was quiet. In this family, quiet was worse than screaming. "I valued you more than anyone, and you used the alliance to ruin us." The room was silent. My father's face was gray. Dongji looked like he was watching a car crash. Even Huaying had the decency to look away. I met grandfather's eyes. Didn't look away. Didn't apologize. "I used it to save us." I told him the truth, or at least the version of the truth that mattered. If Sunyang acquired Yagen now, the debt would crush them. The bank would pull the credit line. The whole group would implode. But if Smart Era handled the acquisition, with its dollar reserves, its foreign assets, its Coca-Cola partnership, Sunyang stayed clean. No risk, no debt. 30% of Yagen's future profits would flow back to Sunyang. I'd take the hit if it failed. The family would survive either way. Grandfather stared at me. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Pride versus survival. Anger versus arithmetic. The same equations he'd been running his whole life. Then, Uncle Dongji said the only useful thing he'd ever contributed to a family meeting. If you don't let him do it, Chen Daojun will. And that was true. Daojun's company, Miracle, had been growing in the shadows for years. Wu Shixian had been quietly amassing capital. If we didn't move on Yagen, they would. And a Daojun with an automotive empire was a Daojun with enough power to challenge Sunyang directly. Grandfather sat back down. "Then, I'll wait for your good news," he said. 7 words, each one ground out like a stone through a mill. But they were permission. Grudging, furious, humiliated permission. I nodded, stood up, walked out. In the hallway, I stopped, leaned against the wall, closed my eyes. I'd just outmaneuvered my own grandfather, the man who gave me my first piece of land, the man who sat with me in a warehouse and shared his love of cars, the man who said, "Good, good, good," when I gave him a porcelain vase at age 9. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself it was the only way. I wasn't sure I believed it. The next morning, I drove to Cheongsimjai. Xingjun was in the garden, chasing grandmother's dog around the fountain, laughing like the world was simple. He saw me and waved, jogged over with that grin, the one that could melt glaciers. "Little brother, I made coffee. It's terrible. Come drink it with me." I laughed. Actually laughed. Not the kind I performed at board meetings or used to disarm rivals. A real one. The kind that came from somewhere I thought I'd bricked shut years ago. We sat on the porch. He handed me a cup that tasted like burned dirt. I drank it anyway. He talked about wanting to travel, about a restaurant he'd found that made the best dumplings in Seoul, about a dog he wanted to adopt. Simple things, small things, the kind of things that billion-dollar men forget to care about. I looked at him, this man who didn't know how many times I'd saved his future, who didn't know about the prison cell, who didn't know that every cold deal I'd ever made was, at its core, a wall built around him. And I thought, in another life, that laugh ended behind glass. That face went hollow, where no one came to visit. That warmth died on a concrete floor, and nobody mourned it, except a stranger who remembered too late. Not this time. Across the city, Yagen Motors sat unclaimed. Daojun's shadow was growing. The political puppet was loaded. 2 women, neither chosen. And the old man upstairs, the king of everything, was sitting alone in his study, wondering if his most capable grandson was his greatest asset or his most dangerous threat. The crisis wasn't the end. It was the audition. Everything before this, the election bet, the garbage dump, the smartphone, the plane, the steal, the alliance, the dollars, all of it was practice. The real game, the one where I find out if I can save my family without becoming the thing that destroys them, that game was just beginning.